All right, welcome. We're glad you're here. My name is Eric White. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the library. We are excited to have Dr. Jeremy Vetter, Estes Park local and history professor, join us to talk about Rocky Mountain biological stations in the early 20th century. And as you may know, our January theme here at the library is Colorado 150, exploring our legacy, celebrating the sesquicentennial of our state. Throughout the month, we are holding talks, discussions, and fun events related to Colorado history and maybe a little prehistory. So before we do formal introductions, I will just mention that the library sees as part of its job bringing in speakers to share their own perspectives for the enrichment of the community. Speakers' perspectives are purely their own. All right, now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jeremy Vetter. He was born and raised in several small towns in Nebraska, where he also attended the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. His graduate degrees are from Oxford University in England and the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. His previous academic positions were as a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, Germany, and as an assistant professor of history at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He has taught courses and conducted research at the University of Arizona since 2010. His biggest hobby is mountain hiking in Arizona and Colorado, and he also enjoys music, politics, and reading. I'm going to welcome him in just a moment. Let me get his presentation ready to go. All right. Please welcome Dr. Jeremy Vetter.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Eric, and thanks to all of you, both online and here in person. I especially commend those in person who braved the roads and snow this evening to come to this talk, and I appreciate you being here. I am a historian of science and the environment in the American West, and I do live part year here in Estes Park. My wife and kids live here in Estes Park, but my academic post is in Tucson, Arizona, which is a very different sort of climate this time of year. So I'll be going back there in a week or two for the start of the spring semester, but I come back here whenever I get the chance in the middle of the semester or definitely during the summer breaks and winter break, and love Estes Park just as much as many of you do here as well, I'm sure. So what I wanted to talk about today is an interesting episode in Colorado history, which is not often thought of as a major part of Colorado history, but is actually kind of important in the history of knowing the environment of the Rocky Mountains. And that is the wave of new biological field stations that were founded in the early 20th century in the Rocky Mountains. And I want to just talk a little bit about why these stations were established, what it was like to be at these stations, why they set them up the way they did, and just to give you a little bit of a sense of this important episode in Colorado history. I think that it has a little bit of an Estes Park connection. Much of what I'm talking about tonight, the main case study I'm going to be talking about, is just a little bit south of here, actually, in the Indian Peaks area, in a place called Toland, Colorado. Have any of you ever been to Toland, Colorado? You know where I'm talking about? You have, actually. Big fan. Yeah. So I was surprised. A lot of people haven't been there before, so I'm impressed that we have some. This is. Have any of you ever taken Amtrak from Denver to Granby through the Moffett Tunnel? If you've done that, you've gone right through on the east side before you hit the Moffett Tunnel from Denver. You would go right through the valley that was the location of the mountain laboratory of the University of Colorado between 1909 and 1919. I'm going to talk about some other Rocky Mountain biological laboratories from time to time, but that's the main one I'm going to focus on, and that's what all the images, well, all but one of the image slides are from that station. So I did a bunch of research at the University of Colorado Boulder Library, at Nordland Library, probably 2 decades ago about this, and I've published a couple things about this. I just wanted to mention the works that this comes from. I have a book which came out now about 9 or 10 years ago. Hard to believe, been that long. But this book, Field Life, is the book that got me tenured at the University of Arizona, is a history of field science in the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains regions overall. So it goes through all the different kinds of field work, including field stations. The chapter on field stations in this book uses the Toland Mountain Laboratory as one of the narrating examples. The other one is actually an agricultural experiment station in western Nebraska, in North Platte, Nebraska. But it treats field stations of all kinds, forestry stations, mining stations, a lot of agricultural stations, and biological mountain laboratories like the ones I'm talking about tonight. But what I tried to do in this book was really to think about all the different ways field science was done in the railroad era between the Civil War and World War I. And so this really comes from that chapter on field stations from this book. It also comes from a chapter in this older book, which I edited with a bunch of other scholars contributing to, which was my first publication about this topic, Rocky Mountain High Science, Teaching Research and Nature at Field Stations, which is one of the chapters in this book. So if you're curious what the research publications that this talk is coming out of, you're welcome to come up and look at these books later if you want, just to see. These are academic books. Academic history has the virtue of being more understandable than works in a lot of disciplines in academia, but we still have our own preoccupations about, reviewing the historiography and literature and talking about, kind of conceptual issues that we're debating within the discipline. But I think that it's pretty understandable to a general audience. But I'm going to try to make this talk tonight to be a little more user-friendly and a little bit less academic-y. But if you want more of the academic-y stuff, I've got stuff in these books, and also an article that has almost the same title as tonight's talk, which was published in the Journal of the History of Biology a number of years ago. So I can give anybody a citation for that later if they want to look it up, if you're really into the original academic research. But what I'd like to do tonight is a little bit more of a friendly tour through this interesting episode in Colorado history, keeping in mind this is not just an episode in Colorado history, it's an episode in the history of the Rocky Mountains in general. There were Rocky Mountain field stations in Wyoming, in Montana, New Mexico, Utah. Colorado had the most, though, and the most kind of prominent ones in the early 20th century. And so it's appropriate that I focus on this area. I will bring in Montana just a little bit because they had a really interesting station up on Flathead Lake, south of Glacier National Park. If any of you have ever been up there, you might know that area. And so I'm going to mention that just a little bit, but mostly I'm going to focus on Colorado. But really, it's important when you're thinking about biological field stations as a thing in the history of science, it's important to realize that this is coming after a couple of other waves that were really important in how scientists did their work. So in the middle of the 19th century, by about the 1860s or 70s, there was starting to be a debate within, especially the life sciences, about what's the best way to do scientific research. And it was really the era of what we think of as the rise of a laboratory as the iconic place to do good science. And what's great about laboratories is that you can control all the variables in a laboratory, right? You can try to have an apparatus that's isolated from the environment around it. Theoretically, the work that you do in a laboratory should not depend on where the laboratory is. It could be in Estes Park, it could be in Tahiti, it could be in Miami, Florida, it could be anywhere, but you should get the same results because laboratories are controlled indoor environments. But over time, life scientists especially thought, well, but we also need ways to more rigorously study the environment in all its messiness, not just the controlled variables we can study in laboratories, but also to study the field, the natural environment. And the field came to be thought of as that area outside the lab where you can't control all the variables. But what a lot of scientists were trying to do in the late 19th century was to figure out how to bring some of the rigors of the laboratory out into the field, how to use measurement and precision and develop new instruments that you could use to record data about nature. And so the biological stations really came out of that impulse. But the first ones were not in the Rocky Mountains. Does anybody know where any guesses what kind of environment they first put field stations in? You're close. Well, lakes are actually lakes. Someone in the audience said the Lake District in England. Lakes were actually kind of the second wave. The first wave was on the seacoast, actually, seaside laboratories. And the most famous one of all in the United States is Woods Hole in Massachusetts, the Marine Biological Laboratory, as it was known. MB, I think it's still called that, maybe. It's funny, as a historian, I stop thinking, what are things called today? Because I just read about all the 150 years ago what it was called. I especially run into trouble with that one on the museum that's in Denver, the Natural History Museum, because in the era I study it, it was called the Colorado Museum of Natural History, but now it's the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, but the Woods Hole became a summer resort for scientists, as it was called by the historian Phil Pauley, and historians have recognized that since the last third of the 19th century, that scientists wanted places to go in the summertime, especially academic scientists who were based in universities, who were teaching on an academic year schedule. They wanted places to go in the summer where they would have access to material from nature, from the environment. And because of the role of marine organisms in a lot of important questions, especially in developmental biology, embryology, and kind of how organisms develop, they wanted to be near the seacoast so they could get fresh specimens from the ocean, basically, to help study these developmental problems. And so a lot of the early stations were on the seacoast. There were some on the west as well that were later established at Friday Harbor in Washington State, elsewhere on the Pacific coast. But the first ones were on the US East Coast and in Europe, on the coast of the Mediterranean, coast of the North Sea. These field stations were, in some ways, more lab-like, in that they had labs there that people spent most of their time inside the lab, but then they would go get materials from outside. Now, there were some people who would study the natural environment around those seacoast locations, but it was less in that vein compared to the Rocky Mountain stations that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. The next big wave, kind of towards the end of the 19th century, were the lakeside stations. And these were especially in the interior regions, in the Midwest, especially places like Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan. The upper Midwest has a lot of lakes. People like to go to these lakes in the summertime. And so this became the place where you could set up a field station for biologists, especially during the summertime. The third big wave, though, was in the mountains. And it's interesting to think about why the mountains were so appealing. Now, obviously, there's a variety of reasons the mountains are appealing. The mountains are cooler in the summertime. It's a nice place. You all are in Estes Park, so you know what's nice about this. It's kind of ironic, actually. I'm giving this talk in the middle of the winter because almost all of the work I'm talking about was done over the summer. This is a summer phenomenon that I'm talking about. Some of these field stations aren't even really the one in Colorado that's probably the most prominent in the world today is the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Gothic, north of Crested Butte, which attracts scientists from all over the world and has been, kind of an iconic it was founded a little later, but it is closed mostly in the winter. You can't even drive up there. So these are really summer places. So it's kind of odd I'm speaking in the middle of the winter, but I will say that they were attractive as summer locations to go. But there was a scientific argument as well for why the Rocky Mountains were a good place to go. So this is the place that the first biological field station of the University of Colorado is located, which is the Mountain Laboratory in the Valley, Toland, Colorado. This existed basically from about and I see I made a typo on there, which is actually revealing kind of one of those Freudian slip type typos, because I called it a summary laboratory in the quote. I add that extra Y. But the fact that it was summery, that people wanted to experience a summer climate, was a big part of the appeal of these places for attracting students and faculty to live in these places over the summertime. So that is perhaps a revealing typo, but this existed for about 10 years, and it's no longer where the main mountain station of the University of Colorado is. Does anybody know where it is now? Yeah, Niwot Ridge. It was known for a long time as the Science Lodge, but I think they've kind of moved to a more kind of formal name now. The Mountain Research Station of the University of Colorado. It's a beautiful place. I've had workshops there before, and it's a really great location. But there's one major problem that location has compared to this one, which almost entirely explains why they put the first field station in this mountain valley. And I've already hinted a little bit at what that reason was. Did anybody pick up on what is the reason why this valley in particular was the place they had to put the field station? That's right, exactly. That's where the railroad went. And this is a time just before there were automobiles, but it's just before the mass production of automobiles and just before a lot of people acquired them and before roads were built in the 1920s for people to easily travel. So railroad access was paramount. In fact, the other most prominent field station in the Rocky Mountains during this era was the Alpine Laboratory, which is located above Manitou Springs on the way up Pikes Peak, which also had the cog railway. So Frederick Clements, who's one of the most important early ecologists in the United States, a lot of his theories would later become controversial, but he was extremely influential in the early 20th century. Frederick Clements had his summer field station called the Alpine Laboratory on the cog railway on Pikes Peak. So the two railroads that went high up over the mountains were the two places where they put field stations. So it's very determined, you might say, where they wanted to put this. But in all of their promotional materials for putting field stations in the mountains, they had a scientific argument that was relevant both for teachers and for researchers, which was really foundational to the claims of why these field stations in the mountains were even better than field stations at the seacoast or at lakes. And that has to do with the altitude gradient between the plains and the alpine heights. And so they, over and over again, would come up with all kinds of ways of describing this. So for example, in one, the founder of the mountain lab in Tolland, he said that in this small space, you could cover as much ground as between Illinois and Ellesmere, which is up in like northern Canada. So you could experience a range of environments that would ordinarily require traveling over a great distance, but you could experience these altitude gradients of different vegetation zones from the mountains, from the plains, through the foothills, through the montane zone, up to the subalpine forest, all the way up to the alpine tundra. And you could explore and study this region all from one place. So this was the great argument they had, which attracted a lot of people to these mountain stations. Also, it's nice in the summertime. So that can't be ignored. But the scientific reason why these were such desirable sites is because they allowed you to study nature and the changes and variations and from that would ordinarily require huge journeys over space. So it's in some ways compressing space into a vertical gradient. And this was, one of them they compared, it was like going from Maine to South Carolina, all within a few miles. I'm not quite, that one always baffled me a little because I thought, well, for one thing, Maine and South Carolina are much more humid, and also they're on the seacoast, but there were different variations of this, but it was always some really further south place, or Midwestern at least, and some really far northern place. And the idea was that you could study all these places without traveling nearly as far. So this was a big argument that they would make. This is a map that depicts where this site is that comes from one of the publications about the summer laboratory, which I did spell correctly there, although I think I forgot a space in there. Anyway, so this is down in Gilpin County for those who haven't been there before. If you drive the Peak-to-Peak Highway down towards Central City, you pass Nederland, and by then you've passed where the University of Colorado Station is now. But if you keep going past Nederland all the way down to where the Denver-Rio Grande Railroad comes through there at Rawlinsville, and then you turn and take the gravel road up the mountain, you will eventually reach Tolland, which is where they had the mountain lab. And this depicts the Continental Divide over there on the left side and some of the lakes that they studied. And so you can get some idea here about what was attractive about the different kind of places you could visit from Tolland. And all the way up to the Continental Divide and all the way down to the plains. Now, of course, the location of the railroad there presented not just an easy way to access the site to get in and out, but also a disturbance, right? Because the railroad is changing the environment that it goes through. But in the early days of this, they mostly ignored that. They didn't really want to make that much out of this because they were trying to figure out general rules about how vegetation varies depending on different conditions of moisture, different altitudes. The presence of the railroad was at one time a very convenient thing, but also disruptive. But I found it interesting, and I put that on this slide, that even though it's near a railroad line, this is seen as a possible end stage for vegetation, even though it's right by this railroad embankment. But I think it's notable that This is something that field scientists always have to wrestle with in their work, which is that doing the work itself can disturb the environment you're studying. And so they go to great pains, and there's a lot of methodological discussion about the practices you need to follow in order to minimize or account for human disruption of the natural environment. Now, there have been a lot of other ecologists in more recent times, and I'm not really going to get into this, but who've tried to develop new kinds of models that don't rely on human presence as a disturbance. But in this time period, that was a much more common way of thinking about ecology, which is that there's a natural state of vegetation. This is especially in the work of people like Frederick Clements, the guy who had the other lab down by Pikes Peak. The idea that there's a series of successional stages that you go through that you'll reach ultimately an end state or a climax state of vegetation that will, be kind of the balanced state for that vegetation. And so what they're trying to do ecologically, the scientists who studied up here, was to figure out what are the different associations between altitude, rainfall, water, moisture level. So people would develop methods for studying this rigorously. They would set up things called quadrats. Does anybody know what a quadrat is? Any ecologists in the room? This is where they would stake out like a meter square or some square out in the natural world, and then they would count every plant in there. And so you could quantify the presence. Other times they would just indicate whether certain species were present or abundant in a certain place. But if they wanted to really rigorously study it, they could mark off quadrats and study those. They developed things like soil moisture index. That's one thing that was in the publications, where you would assign a number to different states of soil moisture and then correlate that to which kinds of plants grew there, and to try to figure out what the correlations are, the relationships. These are the kinds of projects that they were engaged in at these field stations. Now, they were also, it must be said, interested in more traditional questions. They did a lot of this kind of work where they were just trying to collect and identify species, what we think of as kind of traditional natural history, dating back to many centuries earlier, but still robust and important in this time period, which is just what all is out there. How can we name it? How can we describe it? How can we differentiate different species and different subspecies? And if especially the people who were students or who were sometimes classroom teachers from like high schools would come and study at these summer labs and make collections to take back to their home schools. And so they really loved having access to all these different plants, and they could go up to the alpine heights and all the way down to the foothills. But the kinds of more rigorous studies they did with soil moisture indexes and with quadrats and the other more rigorous methods, those tended to be more in the area right around the field station because they required a lot of monitoring. They required a lot of time to go to the site and make sure to keep monitoring it over time. And it takes a lot of time to go up and down. So I wanted to show you at this point a different slide of a different place, which is the University of Montana's biological station that I mentioned earlier, because it illustrates, I haven't seen illustrated quite as well anywhere else. And so that's why I clipped this one out. So this was on Flathead Lake, as I mentioned earlier, north of Missoula, which was the home-based institution where Morton Elrod, the guy who set it up, the biologist who founded it, but he set up the summer field station up on the east side of Flathead Lake at Yellow Bay, and that's also a very nice station. It's sort of a combination with these Midwestern lake stations because it's got a huge lake there, and so they had boats and they had the whole apparatus for that type of work as well. But they had these things they put there that they called field tables, and you can see one depicted here. And it was basically a way to take the lab out into the field, like literally to have a laboratory table with an apparatus on it, but that was sitting outdoors, exposed to the open air, out in the natural world. And that is what's depicted in this picture. But what I found interesting about it is they labeled it a field table, but when you look in the text and how they describe it as a laboratory table. And so they're kind of equivocating about whether we are in the lab or in the field. They've brought elements of the lab into the field to make the work that's done there more rigorous, or at least perceived that way by other scientists. And I think what that really helps us understand is the struggle, really, that field scientists always have to deal with throughout the history of science, which is how to compete with the epistemic standards of a laboratory, where you have, rigorous control of variables, and you're able to isolate the thing you want to study and to take all the complexity that would interfere or maybe confound the variables you're studying out of the picture. But out here, you're exposed, you're out there, and there's the sunshine, there's the wind, there's all the factors of the messy kind of world outside impinging on this laboratory or field table. And they would equivocate on whether are we in the lab or are we in the field. And the one on the right shows more clearly the indoor lab that was there. And you may also notice, by looking at this picture, that even though this is the early 20th century, that women were a big part of the field station experience. There were a lot of them had a lot of women participants, especially students who were from the universities who participated in the field stations. But this is an indoor laboratory, and this kind of indoor laboratory is in some ways more of a representation of a lab that doesn't, what's going on in that lab should not be affected by the environment outside that lab. The only thing that's going to affect it from the environment outside is the stuff you bring in to study. Whereas this lab over here is a field lab. It's a lab that's exposed to the elements. And so this really dramatizes this kind of methodological discussion around this time as laboratory science was really surging in its influence within science. New kinds of ideas, and this is the era when at places like Columbia University, they were developing the early foundations of genetics, right? They were developing genetics through laboratory work on little Drosophila flies, right? They were studying flies in laboratories and breeding them completely indoors in a lab. And so all the people who are working outdoors, they needed to make a good case for why the outdoors is a suitable place to do rigorous science. And so that's a struggle, that's sort of a thread that runs throughout all of their papers, through their discussions. And I think they made a pretty good case for it because they were able to attract a lot of people to these stations. I'd say in the publication world, they had some achievements and they were able to get some notable publications out of it, but a lot of it was always an uphill struggle against the kind of rising prominence of laboratory science. So they did everything they could, I guess is what I'm saying, to bring elements of the laboratory into the field and to show that they were doing that, to show that they were developing instruments that could withstand field conditions, instruments that could survive wind or heat or freezing or other kinds of elements that you might experience in the out of doors. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I want to highlight a few other elements of this before I finish, which is that the lived experience of people at these field stations was a remarkable part of the experience. And if all you do is read the scientific publications, you would never get a full sense of this. That what it requires to fully understand this is to read the promotional materials, to read their letters, to read their diaries. And if you do that, what you realize is that this was as much an intense social experience as it was purely scientific research. So if you think about it, in a laboratory, there's quite a lot of, I don't know if any of you have ever spent time in a laboratory or been in a lab culture, but there's a lot of personal interaction in laboratories, right? There's people there and you're interacting with them on a daily basis. But then at the end of the day, unless you're really hardcore, I guess, you go home, right? You go home and you go to live to a house somewhere else, and you come back the next day. It's a job, right? It's a day job, or it should be. I mean, sometimes people stay in the lab all night long, right? But in the field, at these field stations, you're basically living with the people that you're your students, with your graduate students, with visiting professors from other places. And so it becomes this intense social experience where people from different universities are interacting. They're at campfires together, right? They're sitting around the campfire at night. Some of these places, most people are sleeping in tents, right? So they do try to repurpose built environment whenever they can. So that's what's depicted here in this picture. Toland is an actual small village. There were buildings there. They rented out some of them. They built, I think, one of them custom for a while. But so they had buildings, especially for the laboratories. It's interesting, the thing they prize most to have in a good indoor building is the laboratory. That's the thing that needs to be the most enclosed because you can't have environmental disturbances in the laboratory. But they slept in tents oftentimes. If they did have housing, it was usually either communal or in very close proximity to one another. So the intense level of social engagement and interaction that took place was a really integral part of the lived experience of these places, these laboratories in the field. And even though this is a little bit of a staged picture where they're all dressed up, I don't think they look like this normally, I would guess, but it's Okay. And finally, I wanted to use this picture to highlight the just the kind of general environs of the Tallinn, the village, and then this Park Lake here, and some of the mountains around there, in order to remind me to talk about recreation and the kind of uh, benefits of being at a mountain lab from the perspective of people who went there, which is that you had access to recreation in the summertime. And this is where a little bit of background in late 19th century middle class culture can be very helpful. So there's a number of historians a couple decades ago who really pinpointed what was happening here, which Cindy Aaron, a historian, she identified, she called it working at play. Because what they needed to show was that they were in a kind of upwardly mobile middle class who wanted to go on vacation, but they weren't just going to be idle on their vacations. They weren't just going to be sitting around, and they were not an aristocracy. They were not people who just had other, they were hard workers, right? And so you could play and you could engage in recreation, but it needed to be work as well. It needed to be productive. It needed to be, that's kind of the origins in the milieu that the whole Chautauqua movement came out of, that some of you may be familiar with. In Chautauquas, you had inspirational speakers and arts, and there was like self-improvement, right? You're engaged in a form of education, self-improvement. You're not just there to, gamble and sit around or engage in idle pursuits. So recreation was a core part of this, but it was always emphasized in all the materials that though recreation is mixed in, the scientific fieldwork always takes priority. And so, you would do recreational outings, but you'd combine them with collecting, field collecting of botanical specimens, of geological specimens, of animals. And so you would engage in a kind of hybridization of a work culture and a leisure and recreational culture. And I would argue that the biological field stations are a perfect place for that. It's a perfect place because they're meaningful. They were meaningful places where people could do significant work, but they could also enjoy the nice cool weather in the summer. They could climb some mountains. They could enjoy some fishing. They could do a lot of recreation, but it was purposeful recreation. And it then gave them the chance to socially interact with colleagues from other places, to inculcate. And I think a lot of these field stations that still exist today, if any of you spent time at one, have any of you spent time at a summer field station? For curiosity, you have? My impression, and I haven't spent a huge amount, I've been there for short time periods, but the kind of social bonding that takes place there of kind of inculcating people socially into a community, but with the purpose of understanding what it means to be a biologist, to understand what it means to think about the world as a biologist, to think about plant life, to think about animal life in a biological vein. It's a socialization mechanism that was really powerful. And there's a lot, if I only really go up to about 1920 in my work, but if I were to take this story maybe someday, I might take it up to the present. And if you study the remarkable persistence of these biological field stations, and I should say, not just biological, there are geological field stations and other kinds too. There's what was originally a forestry station up in the CS, Colorado State University's mountain campus up over the Mummy Range, where I've also been to a few workshops before. That was originally a forestry station. It still is to a certain extent. I mean, it's a forestry and resource science station, I believe. So there's other types. But in all these cases, and the biological ones are really a key example of this, these are meant to be important formative experiences for people to really learn to think and inhabit a kind of scientific persona. Even if they're just students who are not going to go on to PhD careers, but are going to become school teachers, or they're going to go into other walks of life, to always think of themselves having that scientific approach to thinking about nature. So I think that's ultimately what a lot of these stations were about. And I would be really curious, apparently I don't know if anybody knows about this, but there was a short-lived biological field station in Estes Park, according to some of the lists I've found. So by the 1930s and 40s, people were compiling lists of all the biological field stations in the world, and there's a directory that lists them, and one of them indicates a short-lived University of Denver field station in Estes Park. I have not been able to find any evidence about it, so they didn't have any obvious collections at University of Denver, and so I need to keep looking and find. But sometime in the early to mid 30s, they had one here somewhere, but I don't know exactly where. So I need to figure out where that is. The other big one to study is the one I mentioned earlier, the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, RMBL. Sometimes they call it Rumble. That is a really famous station. It's up north of Crested Butte, and it is a remarkable place. It's one of the few that's not tied to a specific university. It's its own nonprofit that was organized by a group of scientists from different universities, all working together. And so they founded this station, and it really took off, and it's become uh, a lot of like science policy advisors to presidents have spent time there. A lot of famous scientists who they treasure the time they spent there. And so I think I heard one of my colleagues in environmental history who's got a personal connection to there, maybe writing a history of it. So I've kind of thought, well, I'll let her do that because I got plenty of other projects I've been doing. But I think there's a lot of scope for continuing to study why it is that biologists are willing to invest so much time and energy into keeping these stations going, and especially to keeping them going as an experience for their students, undergraduate and graduate students, to go to these places and really learn what it means to see the world as a biologist in the environment. So that's where I'll leave it, and then we'll go to some questions.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy. So it's Q&A time. Just a little setting the stage. I will call on folks, and I'll be alternating our in-person audience with our online audience. In-person friends, please wait for me to get to you with the microphone before saying your question. Otherwise, we may need to repeat it. And online friends, as a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat. I'm going to leave the presentation up on the screen because we have at least one question about the photos in the presentation. So I'm going to start with an online question. There is deadfall in the foreground of the first photo for the mountain lab in Tolland. Was this from logging for the railroad or other development or a natural wind event?
Well, I don't know the answer for sure to that, but what I always imagined when I saw this is that it was probably logging. And I'll tell you the reason I think that, and then if anybody wants to debate and provide a reason why I'm wrong, I'm totally open to that because I don't really know the answer. But I always assumed it was logging because you see in a lot of the pictures that there are fewer trees than we would normally see. And there was a huge demand for wood resources during this time period in this area. And so I always just kind of in my mind imagined that for the most part, there's a lot of logging going on, especially in proximity to the railroad. So the fact that we're in a valley near a railroad line makes me think that's the most likely culprit. But I could, if somebody notices a clue in this picture, I would be willing to be corrected on that because I honestly do not know the answer for sure. Just hold a second so we can get the mic.
If it's a logging area, your trees will have stumps and cleaner cuts. And it's hard to tell from this particular photo. They would not typically drop trees across each other. They would drop them and drag them. And it's hard to tell from this photo.
Yeah, so maybe some of the other photos would show some of those clues to tell us definitively.
Who else has got a question?
Thanks very much. First, on the lab that's above, that's at Gothic above Crested Butte. Recently, Rocky Mountain PBS did a very nice segment on that, and it was very interesting to see their report on that. And then I'm wondering with the Tolland one, why did it close down in 1919, and what succeeded it?
Okay, so thanks for the recommendation about the PBS show. I haven't actually seen that yet. I didn't even know it existed. So thanks for letting me know. I wasn't aware that was recently. I actually have I published the work on this more than about 8 years ago, and so I haven't kept up with the most recent stuff. So I will definitely want to check that out, especially to find out, the more recent story. As for the closure, I the sources are not that I've found so far are not completely clear cut about that, about why. I think the way I interpret it, so it existed from about 1909, although some of the University of Colorado websites will say 1908. I understand why they're saying that. It's because they started putting it together then. That the first full-fledged season was 1909. It existed for only 10 years in that valley. And then they moved it to Niwot Ridge, where it is now. And there was a couple of different factors that played into it, and I have a hard time distinguishing which was the most important. The first was the enabling factor of the spread of the automobile and roads, which meant they were no longer tied to needing to be in a place where there was a railroad. So that freed them up to go elsewhere. But there was also a change in the kind of leadership. So the guy who was the head of it during the 10 years, another guy came along who was instrumental in founding the new one, and I think he had a somewhat different vision of what they wanted to do with it. So early on, it was oriented, if you think about the kinds of research they did, I think they had a slightly different orientation of what they were most interested in studying. So the early research at the Mountain Lab was mostly in field ecology of the kind of variety I was mentioning earlier, soil moisture index, different presence or absence of different vegetation at different levels. So when you're doing that type of work, or you're setting up quadrats, it's nice to have these big open meadows where you can set up the quadrats and you can travel on the railroad up or down to much higher, much lower, and measure it at different altitudes. The kind of research that they did later on started to tend more and more over time towards the kind of more alpine-oriented work. And in fact, there's a whole set of, I don't even know all the details of it. Maybe some of you know more than I do, actually. I've hiked up there a time or two and I've seen it, but there's a whole observatory up there on Niwot above tree line, and there's like a whole like alpine research center up there. So I think they've become a little more interested, and it's higher up actually. So Toland is about 8,900 feet above sea level, which is higher than here, obviously a little bit higher than here, but kind of within our range. The Mountain Research Station on Niwot Ridge is, I think, over 10,000 somewhere. I can't offhand, I have it written down in here somewhere, the exact elevations of all these places, but it's a little higher up. I think they were developing an interest that was heading to taking them more towards the higher elevations, and they had a personnel leadership change, and all that stuff was all kind of happening at the same time. They were freed from needing to be there because of the railroad. They could go anywhere they wanted. I assume all those things kind of played into it. But somebody may be able to point me towards a document that definitively shows what the main reason was, but I think it all kind of overlapped, is my honest kind of reading of all the different sources, that there were a number of different factors all playing into it.
All right, I have a couple quick notes from online members of the audience. One says, there were faculty who were using the camp in the City of Boulder watershed who took over the main focus of research and recreation for CU. The station then moved to Niwot Ridge when the city kicked them out of the Boulder Creek area in the 1920s.
Oh, it could be. Yeah, I mean, that could be the final push factor. I thought that was slightly later, but it may be that was the determinative factor that pushed them away.
And a question, do you know what people were paid for their summer research? Was it part of their university pay?
Well, it's hard to generalize across the board because situations were different, but overall, they were paying for this. It cost people money to go do this research. They believed in it so much that they would save up money to go and pay the cost of spending their summers up there. But a lot of it was funded. Actually, a lot of the stations, this wouldn't be all of them. So the Alpine Lab that Frederick Clements ran had no undergraduates, but most of the stations' budgets were upheld by summer tuition and fees from students. The fees paid by undergraduate students was really important to the budgets of these places. And so oftentimes the faculty, they could go and they could get maybe modest compensation or just the benefit of being, having a place to stay, up in the mountains. And so it was not a heavily compensated thing. I will say that overall, these were always financially places that that were struggling to meet their budgets. Some of them ended up closing. There's a lot of the ones we know most about today are the ones that have stayed open. But if you look at the list that existed in the first half of the 20th century, there were all kinds of these stations that existed for brief periods of time and then kind of went out of business, so to speak. But the way most of them survived financially was through student fees and eventually by more recent times, fundraising and philanthropy have become really important for a lot of these places. Like the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory has a lot of donations and grants that come into that. And so I will also say that as in the post-World War II period, there's a lot more kind of grant-funded science that's driving a lot of this. And it's not really the time period I've studied, but I know just from anecdotal evidence that a lot of the funding comes from research grants, which include money to spend time up at these stations to conduct the research that's on the grant. So a lot of grant funding. Generally speaking, academics are supposed to get grant funding for summer research. So this would be true even if they were in a university laboratory in a city. They would be striving to get research grant money to conduct summer research. Really to conduct research all the time, but summer research would include additional money to live on.
The time period of your historical research was about the same time period as the establishment of the national park system and the establishment of many of the bigger historical national parks like Rocky and Yellowstone. Did you see any complementary aspects of research in the national parks together with these more university research stations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a lot of overlap in a lot of the field scientists who were involved in these stations were also involved in research in the national parks. So for example, the guy in Montana that I had the picture from, Morton Elrod, he did some really important work in Glacier National Park. They took excursions into Rocky Mountain National Park, sometimes for scientific study and recreation. From the Tolland station, they went into the national park. So there was a lot of overlap going on. But the question of, it is also the case that most of the stations that I can think of are not actually in national parks. They're mostly outside national parks. And I think that that's probably a reason for that. I think that the kinds of, because sometimes they would want to conduct research that is more, that would tamper with the environment more than they'd want to do typically in the national park. Actually, I shouldn't say that because they did sometimes go into the national parks and conduct those kinds of studies. But I think they wanted space that they could control. But there are places in this national park that we're near here, in Rocky Mountain National Park, that have a lot of the characteristics of field stations. In fact, I would think of them as kind of in the same genre. The McGraw Ranch over on is basically a field. I mean, it operates to a large extent like a field station. It's not run by a university, but it's visiting. There's little like a center. Got a lot of the characteristics it's meant for research. So I think that over time there have developed more symbiosis, but it is interesting that these were founded in the same time period and yet they weren't put in national parks. But many of them were put not that far away. Of a park nearby.
Were there many scientific papers that were written as a result of the research conducted at these labs?
I would say yes, there were quite a few, but they tended to be written by a relatively small number of the people who were at these labs in their early days. So remember, a lot of the people who are there are either students or they are visiting scientists who are collecting, spending time in a place where they don't have a lot of specimens from a particular area. But some of the people who came back to these sites year after year after year would conduct 10-year studies of changes in vegetation over long periods of time, or even longer than that. And they published in a lot of the prominent, I've got a whole stack of them in here, actually. I don't want to go through them all right now, but there were a lot of, in botanical journals, the Bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Club, which is a leading botanical journal at the time. A lot of botany and ecology journals, if you look through the list of where they published, those were the predominant areas they published in at Tolland and at the Alpine Lab and at other ones from this time period. I'm sure over time, a much wider variety of scientific journals they've published in as time has gone on. I've done a little bit of work also on some field stations down in Arizona, which is, of course, where I am, the university. And there's a really prominent ecological field station down there, which has passed through a variety of different ownerships. But originally, most people call it Tumamoc Hill nowadays. It's on the west side of Tucson. It was originally the Desert Botanical Laboratory, which was funded by the Carnegie Institution of Washington. Clements, the guy with the Alpine Lab, spent a lot of time down there as well. And they published in a lot of the leading botanical and ecological journals. So yeah, there was a significant amount of research done. But one thing I noticed that I thought was kind of interesting is that a lot of the research that was the most published in the highest status journals tended to not leverage the entire environmental variation. So they talked a lot about how you could go all the way from the mountaintops all the way to the plains, but a lot of the really rigorous research they did was right here in this valley and nearby, because they were able to monitor the sites more easily, and they could mark things in the field, and they could go out to them daily, and they could, keep tabs on the instrumentation and make sure it was in working order. And so there's a kind of distance effect where the further away you got from the station, the harder it was to do quantitatively rigorous work where you could monitor the equipment as easily. But and I think that did prompt them in certain cases to set up like little substations, up higher. But I think there was a fair amount of the publications they published in were mostly in fields like that from this station, but botany and ecology.
I have a two-part question. One is, if you went to Toland today, is there anything left of the station that you could see, or a plaque or a marker? And then I think you said it a little bit, but did they actually ride the train? I think this is the time when the train went over, like the Switzerland Road.
It went up higher, yeah.
Way over to the Bullseye Tunnel, right? Before Moffat Tunnel.
Yeah, before Moffat. Yeah.
And did they ride the train to their field sites? Did the train pick them up? And then how far afield did they get from Toland, via the train or walking?
Okay, so there's a lot bundled in there. I've not really poked around there in about 20 years. So I don't know what's there now. But when I went there about 20 years ago to Toland, and really, I've driven through Rollinsville many times since then, but I should go back up there and see it again, right? I'm giving talks on it. I should go. They have a pizza place now. Well, I think maybe it's because when I went there, there were some buildings there that might have dated to the early 20th century, but I could find no concrete evidence of it. It's no longer the field station, so it's moved to a different place, and so it's not really functional that way anymore. And so there's a whole village there, yes, and some of the, if I wanted to go archaeological, I think it might be possible to really study the archaeology of former field sites and field stations. This could be done, but I haven't done that work, and so I don't know. But when I was poking around there, I didn't notice anything like that. I didn't see a pizza place either, but maybe it's more recent. It was in Rollinsville. Okay, yes, that would be different. Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah, well, that's what it was when I was there. And as far as how often did they actually use the railroad to go up and down? My sense from, now it's hard to say for sure because we don't have, diary evidence from most of the people there. We just have occasional scraps. But my sense is that they talked about being able to do that more than they actually did it, but they did use it sometimes. They had some of these studies, they had stations they had to monitor at different elevations, including Rollinsville, all the way up at the top of the mountain where the railroad used to go all the way up over. So they had sites that they were using, and so there were some people who did that, but I got the sense most people weren't doing that every day. Most people were just spending a lot of their time in the immediate area. They would do excursions, either up onto the Continental Divide, over to Rocky Mountain National Park, to different areas where they would go for the day. But the number of people who actually used the railroad, it was most heavily used for just getting to the site, bringing materials in, going back if they needed to. If they were there for a long time, going, weekly to go get supplies or other things they wanted. So they did use the railroad, but it wasn't like they were all constantly riding the railroad up and down. At least that's my impression from the limited evidence we have, is they talked about the prospect of that more than they actually did it, but it was still nonetheless important that they could get there so easily and that they could get supplies in so easily.
Hello. What kind of cooperation existed between the various field sites, regardless of institution?
Cooperation between the sites. That's an interesting question because in some ways they were competitors. If they're trying to attract people to come up in the summertime, and if they could offer more amenities or more desirable activities, so there was maybe a little bit of friendly competition between them. But I also remember in reading some of the letters in the archives that they would visit the other sites sometimes to kind of get an idea and to be kind of friendly and see, a different place and get a sense of how they did things there. So I think it was a pretty friendly competition overall. What is striking, though, as I think about it, as you ask that question, is that I'm having a hard time thinking of any of the studies, at least before 1920. I mean, there could be some later, but it's hard to think of studies that actually involved formal cooperation between different sites. And that is interesting because on the other side that I've studied of agricultural field stations, because the USDA was such a central organizing entity, they had whole networks of field stations like on the Great Plains where they were trying to use similar instruments, similar methods. They had field agents that were actually paid by the USDA to go to the state branch stations across, western Nebraska, Kansas, Montana, the Dakotas, eastern Colorado, and they would station these people and give them lots of instructions to kind of systematize their work and do the same kinds of measurements everywhere and follow the same experimental protocols to some extent. Now, that's a whole different story of how that led sometimes to conflict with the states, because the states oftentimes had different priorities, and so there'd be conflict between, whether the federal USDA or the states. And so, but the point is there were these networks of field stations that were kind of organized into a network to do cooperative experiments. And there wasn't really anything like that. They went to, they read the same journals, they would go to conferences together, but their projects tended to be a lot more, separate from one another. At least in the time period I've studied. I have a hard time thinking of one that was like a truly kind of cooperative project between different field stations. But they certainly knew of each other, they traveled between them, they'd visit each other, and they, were they knew that they were engaged in similar activities, and I think they had a healthy respect for one another. And when one station would figure something out that would really improve what they were doing there, other stations would take note of that.
I've been here since 80. Park either, like you, but I am a monitor for the Estes Valley Land Trust, and down in Allen's Park, near one of the conservation easements, is a place called the Rocky Mountain Hydrological Laboratory, which was professors taking off for the summer, potentially with their families and spending time. And that's exactly what this place was described to me. And there's still a building there with some of the equipment left and a pen stock. And anyway, I'm wondering, you might consider looking into that. That might be what you're hearing about in terms of a local. And we're in Tahosa Valley on the North St. Vrain.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting. So I'm finding over time that whenever I think my list of field stations is complete, there's always more that I didn't know about. And so and especially when you get to fields outside the main ones that are the most visible, like biological stations, but you get to hydrology, you get into mining stations, you get into forestry stations, you suddenly realize there's a lot more out there. So yeah, that's a really interesting example. I had not heard of that place, but I'll go. Is it publicly accessible?
It's on private land.
It's on private land. Okay, so I couldn't just wander over there. No.
Sorry, I don't have the microphone. Could you, off the top of your head, list the ones in Colorado that you're aware of? I mean, we've heard probably 5 that you talked about. Are there others?
Well, I have a list here, which I developed a couple decades ago and I've been slowly adding to. And I could, I don't know if I want to read it off right now, but you could, well, it's not super long, but it's not specific just to Colorado, but Colorado is probably the majority of, well, about half of them are Colorado. And so I'd be happy to show that to you afterwards if you just want to see a sense of it. I mean, for example, there was one at Palmer Lake for a couple of years in the 1920s that was run by McPherson College of Kansas. There was the one in Estes Park I mentioned that existed supposedly from 1928 to 1935. That was run by the University of Denver. So I don't know if you... And the one by Gothic is very prominent. It's very well known. It still exists today. Over by Aspen over there. Yeah, I don't know about that. Yeah, I don't know about that. Also, the data I have here are from a study that this guy did in the late 1930s. And so anything that's after that was not in his list. And because I haven't studied that later time period, I have not added any of the more recent ones since then. But I'm sure there's a lot more today. There's probably, if I had to guess, there's probably as many biological or field stations of all kinds now. There's probably at least as many as I have on this list that were founded since World War II, probably.
All right, we will take one more question.
So you keep mentioning instruments and supplies and stuff they were taking. Do you have any examples of the type of instruments that they were using for their studies? Like, were they monitoring the weather and just identifying plants and stuff, or do you have any information on the type of instruments?
Yeah, well, so the kinds of instruments, a lot of them are meteorological kinds of instruments, like measuring rainfall levels. But there is a lot of weird specialized instruments they would sometimes develop. And the most interesting one that I have actually not studied that much myself, but that some of my colleagues in the history of science have, a couple of them have looked at these special instruments in Arizona that they developed to measure cactus growth, because cacti, they get bigger and smaller during the year, right? When they, take in water and save it. And then, so they were trying to measure continuously, how, the girth of the cactus as it changed over the year. And so they developed a special instrument to do that. But of course, it's difficult because if you have to be careful that it's not going to actually affect the growth of it. If you put something too tight on it, it's going to affect it. But so you want something that will adjust with time. So there were specialty instruments like that to measure the growth of cacti and other kinds of plants. But a lot of them were rainfall gauges. There were I'm trying to think of. So there's a mixture of instruments that one would think of as kind of off-the-shelf standardized instruments, like a basic rain gauge you can put somewhere. But then there were also specialty instruments they would develop over time. And I'm actually not the best historian to ask to really give an authoritative answer about that. But if you want to read more about it, the person who was one of my PhD advisors back in the day, Rob Kohler, wrote a whole book called Labscapes and Landscapes. Or is it Landscapes and Labscapes? I always forget. But he coined this really interesting word, labscape, which describes these kind of ways of converting the field into a more lab-like landscape. And he has a whole chapter on the weird different kinds of instruments that they would develop. Because one of the problems is the kinds of instruments you use in a lab in an indoor environment are not durable and robust enough to survive outdoor conditions. And so they would have to they'd have to redesign them in their own ways. And so a lot of the instruments you see described in the scientific literature are like special ones they developed themselves, right? They're ones that they figured out how to find something that would measure rainfall, but without getting disturbed by animals or wind or, freezing.
Other monitoring instruments came actually from the agricultural side. They had learned how to minimize the impact of wind and stuff like that. So.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true, that a lot of them, and when you look at agricultural experiment stations, they used a lot of these as well. And so you can see the definite kind of flow of the technology out of that sector. And it had a lot. One other thing to realize about, if you start studying field science during this time period, there was a lot more funding for agricultural research than there was for this kind of ecological research, because these were like predominant economic drivers in the settlement of the Great Plains. And so there was a lot of interest in funding these from railroads, from state governments, from the federal government. And so a lot of the things, I think you're right, did start out in a more agricultural context and then got taken into the field. But of course, they do have to deal with certain kinds of wild animals up in the mountains that they don't have to deal with down in the plains. So there are some additional hazards they had to adjust for sure. And there's no farms up in the alpine region, right? So or even the subalpine region, really. So there's environmental conditions they had to adjust for. Anyway, well, yeah, thank you all for your excellent questions. I really appreciate it. And it's been a fun experience to engage with you about history of science environment in Colorado.
All right. Jeremy, I want to thank you for joining us in our wintry laboratory for mountain curiosity. Yeah, I want to thank you all for joining us with your great questions, and I want to thank the Friends of the Library Foundation for supporting everything we do. Just a note about a few upcoming programs. On Sunday, we've got Her Place on the Map, an afternoon with Sarah Hahn Campbell, in which Denver author Sarah Hahn Campbell will share the history of Rocky Mountain National Park landmarks that are named for women. These come right out of her book, which we will also have available in partnership with McDonald Bookshop. And then on Monday, Katie Colson from the Rocky Mountain Conservancy will be here to teach folks how to customize their own first aid kits for different types of trips into the backcountry. On Wednesday evening, we have books and beverages about history. That's like a bring your own book club. So pick a history book that you think everybody should read and bring it to the book club. We'll have hot beverages. And then finally, next Friday at the Barrel, it is Colorado History Trivia Night. So come, bring your history knowledge. Come by yourself and we'll match you with a team, or come with a group of people. We'll have fun prizes to give away to the winning teams, and fun will be had by all. I will send out an email to everyone who registered with a short little survey. Let us know what you thought of tonight's program, and I'll have all of our lineup for the month, for our Colorado History Month there as well. And have a great evening, everyone.